What did Nietzsche mean when he said God is dead? I'm Marco Perry. Welcome to the Perry Platform. Friedrich Nietzsche was a German philosopher who had some very interesting things to say. I want to dedicate today's discussion to exploring one such quote and trying to get at its core meaning. It's quite impactful, and I've been thinking about it for some time, so I'm hoping you can find some value from this talk. Now, that quote, what is it? You may have heard the first sentence, but let's give the entirety of it. Friedrich Nietzsche says, God is dead. God remains dead, and we have killed him. How shall we comfort ourselves, the murderers of all murderers? What was holiest and mightiest of all, that the world has yet owned, has bled to death under our knives? Who will wipe away this blood off of us? What water is there for us to clean ourselves? What festivals of atonement? What sacred games shall we have to invent? Is not the greatness of this deed too great for us? Must we ourselves not become God simply to appear worthy of it? Now, at face value, that might sound dramatic. It might sound like the words of an avid believer, but those two presuppositions are wrong. First of all, Nietzsche was an atheist, so he wasn't particularly interested in the quote-unquote literal death of God. He was asking a deeper question, and that's why the second presupposition that I commonly see is incorrect too. It's not overly dramatic, actually. In fact, he's making a very distinct observation that's playing out today. If we kill or destroy the underlying bedrock of a society and the people, how is that people going to move forward? And really, I think what he was asking is what comes next for the West after this great murder. This was not a proud declaration. He wasn't committing to his atheism and doubling down on the fact that it was successful in its job. In fact, he was worried that what we've done here is going to stain us in ways that we can't wash off. The consequences of such an action might be deeper, more profound than we might have realized. The first question that one must ask themselves is, does a conscious entity need a God figure to navigate in this earth? Now, look at the history of what God, or you can replace that word with religion, has done for civilization. It essentially gave you a guidebook to meaning and living an interpretive good life, and giving you a sense of framework, a sense of interpretation. That is quite handy. Now, this applies to many core concepts ranging from morality to concepts that console someone once you've lost a loved one, how the afterlife might look like. It was a guidebook. Now, having essentially seen principles that combat this in things like the Enlightenment, making it quite hard to subscribe to something like Christianity, which is what he was predominantly referring to, what do you lose? Well, you lose all of that. And what's there to replace it? Well, on this point, there really isn't anything. There are some developing notions now. People like Sam Harris and the new atheist thinkers are trying to come up with a framework to still keep aspects of spirituality and discussions along those lines relevant, but they haven't succeeded at a mass scale yet. With this absence of a God, the question of does someone need that comes up again. Is there a God-shaped hole in the spirit of the West? And it does seem like the answer is yes. Having had that flesh torn out of them and replaced with nothing, people are looking for their own definitions of godliness now. And it's manifesting in strange ways. We're seeing worships of political activities and figures, the far left and the far right. I believe you have all the hallmarks of religion within these ideologies and the ideologues who spew them. Sacred beliefs that cannot be questioned. And if one dare do so, well, you're being dragged to the public square, you're tarred and feathered, and you're being charged with blasphemy. We had the same dynamic with traditional religions, but luckily for everyone, we were able to discover certain principles like the separation of church and state, and we did see the decline of religious extremism. But it's resurging in these new pseudo-religions that aren't being separated in the ways in which we've seen church and state. becoming predominant factors that are overriding all aspects of social life. There are plenty of similarities between somebody who in the past would denounce a holy text and somebody today who would denounce current gender ideologies. You're going to be tarred and feathered and held up as an apostate in both those situations, so we haven't lost our fervor as a community. As a people in the West, we just replaced the text. We've replaced the ideas with something that might be considered even more nefarious, because it's popping up in ways in which we couldn't predict. Every virtue does become a vice in excess. This is a lesson that many people have not taken to heart. You can label a social movement as being for something iconic like freedom, or inclusion for something on the other hand, compassion, but when these things are unbounded and discussions regarding the bounding of such things are seen as a great offense, well, you're going to have a runaway problem where the extremes become more extreme and the detriments become evident, but nobody has the courage to speak up. Very similar to the dynamics of religion that we once seen. Now the death of God has opened the door for a new God to take its place. This is what we're grappling with in the West, and Nietzsche called it quite a while ago. Now there's also another concern of tossing the baby out with the bathwater. It's not to say that religious texts and things like this were perfect by any means, but there were benefits to them. Tidbits of information that were helpful. You can take morality for instance here. For an individual to reason from first principles what exactly is right and what's wrong would be enormously complicated, and I don't think everyone would do that, just given the other things that compete with their time on a daily, monthly, and yearly basis. Individuals would be aimless in this regard. Religion, even given the rudimentary nature of it, provided a very basic roadmap that one could follow to live a relatively stable and good lifestyle. The Ten Commandments pretty much summarize the core things that you do want to stay away from. Then if you have more time, you can dig deeper into the stories, maybe find a role model in a Jesus figure, discover principles that you think would help you in your own life, and they're handed to you. Just read the text and you'll derive meaning and messages from it. To come to something like the Ten Commandments without a prior model, it would take you quite some time, and I think we don't appreciate that. That's certainly one thing that's worth preserving. And if we have tossed it out, whether intentionally or inadvertently, what do we have once again to replace it with? Then you can take something like the trend of growing nihilism and depression. Maybe there's a correlation here to Nietzsche's declaration of God being dead. Notions of an afterlife and rewards to those who were screwed over in this world, even if you were a good person, that can be comforting to know that there is something beyond. This inherently pins some meaning to your everyday actions because every instance of a decision gives you an ability to move closer or further to that end zone. Now, rip the band-aid off and tell all these people, or suppose the fact that God is dead, and take away those presuppositions that they once held that did give them things like meaning, and what do you have left? Well, you have that void. And as we talked about, some people are going to fill it with what seems to be the most popular choice today of politics, but others may not. Others may just keep that void and develop a sense of nihilism, of meaninglessness, and they lose faith in things like the value of their life, and they start asking questions along the lines of, does anything actually matter? Do I actually matter? Do we matter as the human race? In a sense here, you are thrust back into that first principles mindset. You have to derive these things from the ground facts, and that's complicated. It takes time. It takes some very serious thinking and hearing the thinking of others. Many people don't have the time or the luxury to partake in that. So, although answers do seem to be possible to reach out in the ether, getting there is hard now, because that guide that was once taken to at least start knocking on the doorstep has been revoked. Another consequence that comes courtesy of this death certificate is the balkanization of people within a society, and it begs the question of, is tribalism an essential human trait? And are there ways to leverage that beneficially? Now, people come in all different variations, and you have characteristics there. Gender, age, height, race, hair color, shape of your ear, how many hairs are on your body, all these things, right? And theoretically, you can balkanize along any of these lines. Maybe one day people decide to split into groups between those who have an odd number of hair on their body and those with an even number of hair in their body, and they start to hate the other. Foolish, but still theoretically possible. We've seen people balkanize along strange lines like that in the past and currently today. Now, religion did have a unifying force there. With something like Christianity, anyone could be a Christian and basically anyone could convert to it. And it wasn't easy to be kicked out either. There was always the potential for repentance. Now, if you presume that tribalism is that innate human feature that we do look for in in-group, well, religion did serve as a potential outlet for an inclusive in-group at least. Now, people living in a country, they might differ along every other theoretical line. But perhaps if they believe in the same God and some of the same principles that come along with that, they can have some unifying force there. Perhaps you disagree with your neighbor about many things politically and whatnot, but you do still see everyone at church on Sunday, so you're taking part in shared communal activities, and it becomes hard to view them entirely as the devil. Because at the very least, you are both Christian, and this can apply to any other religion around the world, but it does become complicated when the religions themselves balkanize. For example, in Islam, you have Shiite and Sunni and the conflicts that emerge from that. Christianity and some of the sects that are incompatible with others, Mormonism, Catholicism, whatever it's going to be. But at a very basic level, it at least provides a blueprint for bypassing the tribalist circuitry. And now that that's gone, what are we left with? Well, politics dividing, people dividing along other arbitrary characteristics of one's birth. Now, although imperfect, religion wasn't the worst thing that people could align with, especially if many others in the country shared a similar presupposition to the ideas. The entire group could be at least mildly swimming within the same waters, but now everyone has their own bowl. Now, of course, I do think tribalism is something that we have to get over, but until we get to that end point, maybe religion wasn't the worst thing to align on, because anyone could convert to it. There were certain principles there that seemed universal enough that one could accept another into the in-group if they shared them, and things like that. Of course, there are many downsides too that we can spend hours talking about, with religion in particular, but the downsides there are replicable across any other measure that one would use to classify themselves with and to form an in-group around. Now, given these considerations, the natural question that arises is what comes next for the West? Now that we've slain this God figure that did have some useful things for a civilization, basic concepts of morality, a use for tying together communities of different people, and things like that, what's going to happen? Now, Nietzsche didn't know what 2022 would look like, but I did feel like he had a grasp on what was waiting for us. The replacement of a god with something else that might be more nefarious, like politics. The balkanization of the West. Lots of infighting. The rise of nihilism and depression. Things like that. And the last line he put out is something that's worth a lot of thinking about. If we were successful in slaying the old image of a god, what must we become to be worthy of a new image of it? Must we not become gods ourselves? And maybe that's where things are heading. The conceitedness of the human race is tapping into this notion here. Maybe idolizing ourselves isn't the best approach. Perhaps when you view yourself as a god or your in-group as something along those lines, by default you have to view others as demons. That's the dichotomy, after all. Fundamentally, we're dealing with a crisis of meaning, and the seeds of that were planted quite some time ago. It seems like people are just waking up to it now and are impulsively filling the gaps with things that are subpar. It might be easy to reflect back on the people of old and to laugh at some of these silly ideas they held, but we have quite an array of silly ideas ourselves today. What's worse, the religions of old or the modern politics of religion that we're witnessing occur today across the West? One thing that we can't doubt, though, is that we do need to have a serious societal discussion about this. We've replaced an integral part of humanity that has persisted for millennia without a plan. And now we're left in the wake of that destruction, and some of us don't even realize what's happening. I remain hopeful that there is a solution to this problem, though, and it all starts with a conversation like this one. Now, with that, it does bring us to the end of our episode for today. If you enjoyed the talk, be sure to leave a review and share. It'll help us grow. And you can find me online at perryplatform.org and on social media at perryplatform. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you soon.